It was a quiet afternoon in the dense forest, and the sunlight barely peeked through the thick canopy of trees. Jake, a wildlife photographer, was hiking deep into the woods, hoping to capture some rare shots of bears. He had heard rumors of a bear family living near the river, and he was determined to find them. As he walked, the sound of rustling leaves and distant bird calls filled the air. Suddenly, he heard a low, pained growl. It wasn't the usual sound of a bear marking its territory. It sounded desperate. Jake froze, his instincts telling him to stay quiet. He carefully moved toward the noise, his camera hanging loosely around his neck. What he saw next made his heart sink. A massive brown bear was trapped in a mess of barbed wire, its fur matted with blood. The bear struggled weakly, its eyes filled with fear and pain. Jake knew he had to act fast. "Hey, big guy," Jake whispered softly, trying not to startle the bear. "I'm here to help." The bear let out a low growl, but didn't move aggressively. Jake slowly approached, his hands trembling as he pulled out a pair of wire cutters from his backpack. He knew one wrong move could cost him his life, but he couldn't just walk away. Jake's hands were steady now, but his heart was pounding like a drum. The bear's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped. The animal's massive chest rose and fell with labored breaths, and Jake could see the pain in its gaze. He knew he had to act quickly. Every second counted. "Easy now," Jake murmured, his voice calm but firm. He crouched low, trying to make himself appear less threatening. The bear let out another low growl, but it didn't lunge. It was almost as if it understood Jake was there to help. With careful precision, Jake began cutting the barbed wire. The sharp metal groaned as the cutters snipped through it piece by piece. The bear flinched with every sound, its muscles tensing, but it stayed surprisingly still. Jake couldn't believe it. This wild animal, known for its strength and ferocity, was trusting him. As he worked, Jake noticed something else. The bear wasn't alone. A few feet away, partially hidden by the underbrush, were two small bear cubs. They watched him with wide, curious eyes, their tiny noses twitching as they sniffed the air. Jake's heart melted. This wasn't just a bear, it was a mother protecting her young. "You're a brave one, aren't you?" Jake said softly, glancing at the mother bear. "Don't worry, I'll get you out of this mess." The wire was tangled tightly around the bear's front leg, and Jake had to be extra careful not to hurt her further. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he worked, the tension in the air almost unbearable. Finally, with one last snip, the wire fell away. The bear let out a deep, rumbling sound, almost like a sigh of relief. She shook her massive body, sending bits of dirt and leaves flying. Jake stepped back, giving her space. He didn't want to push his luck. For a moment, the bear just stood there, staring at him. Jake held his breath, unsure of what she would do next. Then, to his amazement, she turned and nudged her cubs toward the safety of the trees. Before disappearing into the forest, she looked back at Jake one last time. It was a look he would never forget, a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something almost human. Jake let out a long breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He sat down on a nearby rock, his legs feeling like jelly. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, and the reality of what had just happened hit him. He had just freed a wild bear and lived to tell the tale. But as he sat there catching his breath, he noticed something strange. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No birds chirping, no rustling leaves, just silence. It was as if the entire woods were holding their breath. Jake's instincts kicked in again. Something wasn't right. He stood up, his eyes scanning the area. That's when he heard it. A low, guttural growl different from the mother bear's. It was coming from behind him. Slowly, Jake turned around. His blood ran cold. Standing just a few yards away was another bear, a massive male, its fur bristling and its teeth bared. This wasn't a curious or pained bear. This was a predator, and it looked angry. Jake's mind raced. He had no weapons, no way to defend himself. The male bear took a step forward, its eyes locked onto Jake. He could see the muscles in its shoulders tensing, ready to charge. "Okay, okay," Jake whispered, his voice trembling. "Think, Jake, think." He remembered something he'd read once. Bears don't like loud noises. Without hesitation, he grabbed his camera and slammed it against the rock he'd been sitting on. The loud clang echoed through the forest, and the bear hesitated, its ears twitching. Jake didn't wait to see what would happen next. He turned and ran, his legs carrying him as fast as they could behind him. He heard the bear let out a roar, but he didn't look back. He just kept running, his heart pounding in his chest. When he finally stopped, he was deep in the woods, far from where he'd started. He leaned against a tree, gasping for air. His camera was gone, but he didn't care. He was alive. As he caught his breath, Jake realized something else. The forest was still silent, too silent. He looked around, his senses on high alert. That's when he noticed the tracks, not just bear tracks, but human ones, and they were fresh. Jake's stomach churned. He wasn't alone in these woods. Someone else was out there, and he had no idea if they were friend or foe. Jake crouched low, examining the fresh tracks in the mud. They were boot prints, large and deep, as if someone heavy had passed through recently. His mind raced. Who else would be out here in the middle of nowhere? Poachers, rangers, or something else entirely? The silence of the forest was unnerving. Even the wind seemed to have stopped, as if the woods were holding their breath. Jake's instincts screamed at him to leave, to get as far away as possible, but something kept him rooted to the spot. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the lingering image of the mother bear's grateful eyes. He couldn't just walk away, not yet. He followed the tracks cautiously, his senses on high alert. The prints led him deeper into the forest, toward a part of the woods he hadn't explored before. The trees here were thicker, their branches twisting together to form a canopy so dense that barely any sunlight filtered through. It felt like stepping into another world. After a few minutes, Jake noticed something strange. The tracks suddenly stopped, as if the person had vanished into thin air. He frowned, scanning the area. That's when he saw it. A narrow path, almost hidden by the underbrush. It looked like it had been used recently, the grass trampled and broken branches hanging low. Jake hesitated. Every fiber of his being told him to turn back, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was onto something important. Taking a deep breath, he pushed through the bushes and followed the path. The trail led him to a small clearing. In the center stood a makeshift campsite, a tattered tent, a cold fire pit, and a few scattered supplies. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Someone had been here, and not long ago. He approached the tent slowly, his footsteps silent. The flap was partially open, and inside he could see a backpack, a sleeping bag, and a few empty food cans. But what caught his attention was the notebook lying on top of the backpack. It was open, its pages filled with handwritten notes and sketches. Jake picked it up, his hands trembling slightly. The notes were detailed, almost obsessive. They described bear behavior, migration patterns, and even specific locations in the forest. There were sketches, too, detailed drawings of bears, some with markings that looked like scars or injuries. One page stood out. It had a rough map of the area, with a spot circled in red. Next to it was a single sentence: "The Alpha is here." Jake's stomach churned. This wasn't just some hiker's journal. Whoever had written this was studying the bears, maybe even hunting them. He flipped through more pages, his unease growing. There were notes about traps, bait, and something called the experiment. Before he could read further, a twig snapped behind him. Jake spun around, his heart pounding. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a man. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and a worn-out jacket. In his hands he held a rifle. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the man spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "That doesn't belong to you." Jake's mind raced. He had to think fast. I didn't mean to intrude." he stammered, holding up the notebook. "I was just curious." The man's eyes narrowed. "Curiosity can get you killed out here." Jake took a step back, his eyes darting around the clearing. He needed a way out, but the man was blocking the only path. "Look, I don't want any trouble," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'll just leave, and we can forget this ever happened." The man didn't respond. Instead, he raised the rifle slightly, his finger hovering near the trigger. Jake's heart raced. He was trapped. But then, something unexpected happened. A low growl echoed through the clearing, and the man's eyes widened in fear. Jake turned his head slowly, his breath catching in his throat. Standing at the edge of the clearing was the mother bear he had saved earlier. Her eyes were locked on the man, her massive body tense and ready to strike. Behind her, the two cubs peeked out from the bushes, their tiny faces curious but cautious. The man took a step back, his rifle shaking in his hands. "Get out of here!" he shouted, his voice trembling. But the bear didn't move. Instead, she let out a deep, rumbling growl that sent chills down Jake's spine. It was a warning, a clear message to back off. Jake didn't waste any time. While the man was distracted, he bolted toward the trees, the notebook still clutched in his hand. He didn't look back, didn't stop to see what would happen next. He just ran, his legs carrying him as fast as they could. When he finally stopped, he was back near the river, far from the clearing. He leaned against a tree, gasping for air. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Who was that man? What was he doing in the forest? And what was the experiment? Jake looked down at the notebook in his hands. He knew one thing for sure. He had stumbled onto something much bigger than he had anticipated. And whatever it wasn't over. Jake sat by the river, his hands still trembling as he flipped through the notebook. The pages were filled with cryptic notes and sketches, but one section stood out, a series of entries titled Project Alpha. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic, as if the writer had been in a hurry. "The Alpha is different, stronger, smarter. It's like nothing I've ever seen before. The others follow it without question. If we can control it, we control the entire forest." Jake's stomach churned. Control the forest. What did that even mean? He kept reading, his unease growing with every word. The serum works, but not for long. The bears become aggressive, unpredictable. We need more time, more tests. The Alpha is the key. Serum? Tests? Jake's mind raced. Was someone experimenting on the bears? The thought made him sick. He had to find out more, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed help. As he stood up, he noticed something strange near the riverbank. A small metal canister was half buried in the mud. Jake picked it up, wiping away the dirt. It was labeled with a single word: Serum 7. His heart pounded. This was proof. Proof that something sinister was happening in the forest. He tucked the canister into his backpack and started walking, his mind racing. He needed to get to the nearest town and contact the authorities. But the forest was vast, and he had no idea how far he was from civilization. As he walked, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the trees. The forest felt different now, more ominous, more alive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made him jump. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. After what felt like hours, Jake finally saw a break in the trees. He quickened his pace, relief flooding through him. But as he stepped into the clearing, he froze. Standing in front of him was the mother bear. She was massive, her fur glistening in the fading light. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment Jake thought she might attack. But then she did something unexpected. She stepped aside, revealing a path through the trees. Jake hesitated. Was she helping him? The bear let out a low growl, almost like a command. Jake didn't need to be told twice. He started walking down the path, the bear following close behind. It was surreal, a wild animal guiding him through the forest. As they walked, Jake noticed something else. The forest was changing, the trees were thicker, the air colder. It felt like they were entering a different part of the woods, a part that had been untouched by humans. Finally, they reached a small cave, hidden behind a waterfall. The bear stopped at the entrance, her eyes fixed on Jake. It was as if she was telling him to go inside. Jake's heart raced. What was in the cave? Was it safe? He didn't have much of a choice. The bear wasn't going to let him leave. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The cave was dark, but as his eyes adjusted, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the center of the cave was a massive bear, bigger than any he had ever seen. Its fur was a deep, almost black color, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity. This had to be the alpha. But that wasn't the only thing. Scattered around the cave were more metal canisters, just like the one he had found by the river. Some were empty, others still sealed. And then there were the cages, small rusted cages that looked like they had been used to trap animals. Jake's mind raced. This was the heart of the operation. Whoever was behind this had been using the cave as a base. But where were they now? As he looked around, he noticed something else, a faint sound coming from deeper inside the cave. It was low and rhythmic, almost like breathing. Jake's heart pounded. He wasn't alone. He moved cautiously, his footsteps silent. The sound grew louder as he approached a narrow tunnel at the back of the cave. His hands were sweating, his breath shallow. Whatever was in there, he wasn't sure he wanted to see it. But he had to know. As he peered into the tunnel, his eyes widened in shock. Lying on the ground was a man. The same man he had seen in the clearing. He was unconscious, his face pale and his breathing labored. Next to him was a syringe, its contents spilled onto the ground. Jake's stomach churned. Had the man tried to use the serum on himself, or had something gone wrong? Before he could think further, he heard a noise behind him. He turned around, his heart stopping. The alpha bear was standing at the entrance of the tunnel, its glowing eyes fixed on him. Jake's breath caught in his throat as the alpha bear stepped closer, its massive frame filling the narrow tunnel. The glow in its eyes was unnatural, almost hypnotic, and Jake felt a wave of fear wash over him. This wasn't just a bear. It was something else entirely. He backed away slowly, his mind racing. The unconscious man lay between him and the bear, and Jake knew he had to act fast. He glanced at the syringe on the ground, its contents glistening in the dim light. Whatever was in that serum, it had done something to the alpha, something dangerous. The bear let out a low growl, its teeth bared. Jake's instincts screamed at him to run, but he knew he wouldn't make it far. The tunnel was too narrow, and the bear was too close. He had to think of something, anything. "Easy now," Jake whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm not here to hurt you." The bear tilted its head as if considering his words. For a moment it seemed to hesitate. Jake took a cautious step back, his eyes never leaving the bear's. But then, something unexpected happened. The mother bear appeared at the entrance of the tunnel, her massive body blocking the alpha's path. She let out a deep rumbling growl, her eyes locked onto the alpha. The two bears stared at each other, the tension in the air palpable. Jake held his breath, unsure of what would happen next. The alpha growled again, its glowing eyes narrowing. But the mother bear didn't back down. She took a step forward, her stance protective. It was as if she was defending Jake. The alpha let out a roar, its massive paws slamming against the ground. The cave shook, and Jake stumbled, nearly losing his balance. The mother bear responded with a roar of her own, her fur bristling. Jake knew he had to get out of there. While the two bears were focused on each other, he crouched low and started moving toward the tunnel's exit. His heart pounded in his chest, every step feeling like an eternity. As he reached the entrance, he glanced back. The alpha and the mother bear were still locked in a tense standoff, their growls echoing through the cave. Jake didn't wait to see how it would end. He bolted out of the cave, the cool night air hitting his face as he emerged into the clearing. The forest was eerily quiet. The only sound, the distant rush of the waterfall. Jake's legs felt like jelly, but he forced himself to keep moving. He had to get as far away from the cave as possible. As he ran, his mind raced. The notebook, the serum, the alpha bear, it all pointed to something much bigger than he had imagined. Someone had been experimenting on the bears, trying to control them. But why? And who was behind it? Jake didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to stop them. When he finally stopped running, he was back near the river. His chest heaved as he caught his breath, his hands trembling. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the notebook and the canister he had found earlier. He had to get to the authorities. He had to tell someone what was happening in the forest. But as he stood there, a thought occurred to him. What if the authorities were already involved? What if this was some kind of government experiment? The idea sent a chill down his spine. Jake shook his head. He couldn't think like that. He had to focus on what he could do. He needed proof. More than just a notebook and a canister. He needed something undeniable. As he thought about his next move, he heard a noise behind him. He spun around, his heart racing. Standing at the edge of the trees was the mother bear. She looked at him for a moment, her eyes calm but intense. Then she turned and started walking back into the forest, pausing to glance over her shoulder. It was as if she was telling him to follow. Jake hesitated. He had just escaped a life-threatening situation, and now the bear wanted him to go back into the forest? It was insane, but something in her eyes made him trust her. Taking a deep breath, he started walking. Jake followed the mother bear through the forest, his heart pounding with every step. The night was dark, the moon barely visible through the thick canopy of trees. The bear moved silently, her massive body weaving through the underbrush with ease. Jake struggled to keep up, his legs aching and his mind racing. Where was she taking him, and why? After what felt like hours, they reached a small clearing. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its branches stretching high into the sky. The bear stopped at the base of the tree and let out a low growl, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. Jake followed her gaze and froze. Standing at the edge of the clearing was the alpha bear. Its glowing eyes locked onto Jake, and for a moment he thought it might charge. But then something strange happened. The alpha let out a low, almost mournful sound and slumped to the ground. Jake's eyes widened. The bear was injured. A deep gash ran across its side and its breathing was labored. The unnatural glow in its eyes flickered, as if the serum was wearing off. The mother bear stepped forward, her growl soft but firm. She nudged the alpha with her nose, her actions gentle yet commanding. It was as if she was trying to calm it down. Jake watched in awe. The mother bear wasn't just protecting him, she was trying to save the alpha. He took a cautious step forward, his hands raised. "I can help," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if the bears could understand him. The alpha growled weakly, its eyes narrowing. But the mother bear let out a low rumble, and the alpha seemed to relax. Jake moved closer, his heart racing. He had no idea what he was doing, but he knew he had to try. He knelt beside the alpha, his hands trembling as he examined the wound. It was deep, but not life-threatening. At least not yet. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small first aid kit he always carried. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As he worked, the mother bear watched him closely, her eyes filled with something Jake could only describe as gratitude. The alpha remained still, its breathing steadying as Jake cleaned and bandaged the wound. When he was done, Jake sat back, his hands covered in blood. The alpha looked at him, its glowing eyes now dim. It let out a soft growl, almost like a thank you. Jake smiled weakly. "You're welcome, big guy." But the moment was short-lived. A loud crash echoed through the forest and Jake spun around. Standing at the edge of the clearing was the man from the cave. He looked worse than before, his face pale, his eyes wild. In his hand he held a syringe filled with a glowing liquid. "Stay away from them," the man shouted, his voice hoarse. "They're mine." Jake stood up, his heart pounding. "What are you doing? Can't you see you're hurting them?" The man laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Hurting them? I'm making them stronger, better. They'll obey me, they'll obey us." Jake's stomach churned. The man was delusional, driven mad by whatever experiments he had been conducting. He took a step forward, his hands raised. "This isn't right, you have to stop." The man's eyes narrowed. "You don't understand. No one understands." Before Jake could react, the man lunged at him, the syringe raised like a weapon. Jake stumbled back, but the mother bear was faster. She stepped between them, her massive body shielding Jake. The man hesitated, his eyes wide with fear. But then, with a cry of rage, he plunged the syringe into the mother bear's side. Jake's heart stopped. "No!" The bear let out a roar of pain, her body convulsing as the serum took effect. The alpha bear, still weak but fueled by instinct, charged at the man, knocking him to the ground. The syringe fell from his hand, shattering on the forest floor. Jake rushed to the mother bear's side, his hands trembling. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes filled with pain. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't save her. But then something incredible happened. The mother bear let out a soft growl and nudged Jake with her nose. Her eyes were calm, almost peaceful. It was as if she was telling him it was okay. Tears filled Jake's eyes as he realized what she was trying to say. She had saved him, and now it was her time to go. The alpha bear let out a mournful roar, its glowing eyes now dim. The man lay unconscious on the ground, his experiments finally over. Jake sat there for what felt like hours, the forest silent around him. When the sun finally rose, he knew what he had to do. He gathered the notebook, the broken syringe, and the canisters as evidence. He would take them to the authorities and make sure no one ever hurt the bears again. As he left the clearing, he glanced back one last time. The alpha bear stood at the edge of the trees, its eyes no longer glowing, but filled with something Jake could only describe as gratitude. Moral message. This story reminds us of the delicate balance between humans and nature. The bears, like all wild animals, are not meant to be controlled or exploited. They are living beings with their own instincts, emotions, and roles in the ecosystem. Jake's courage and compassion show us that even in the face of danger, we have the power to make a difference. By respecting and protecting nature, we not only preserve the beauty of the world around us, but also ensure a future where humans and animals can coexist in harmony. Let this story inspire you to stand up for what's right, to protect the vulnerable, and to remember that every action we take has consequences, for better or for worse.